Few people are aware that a lady who is often seen on our streets has been shot through and through with Indian arrows, hacked with a tomahawk, scalped, and left for dead by a murderous band of Indians, and that her only son had been taken captive, and that 5 of the 8 persons who were in the house with her at that time were ruthlessly murdered and tomahawked almost before her very eyes. But such is the case. Truth is stranger than fiction. No imaginary horror depicted by writers of romance can equal in atrocity the facts in connection with the following truthful narration. Early on the morning of the 5th of February, 1868, John S. Friend left his home in Llano County, Texas, to go to Fredericksburg, a town 25 miles distant, leaving his wife and only child, Lee Temple, a promising boy of 8 years, at home. Mr. Friend was accompanied by his 2 neighbors who were brothers. They were sending their wives, who each had an infant child, to stay at the house of John Friend during their absence. There were 8 in the house: Mrs. Matilda Friend and her son Temple, Mrs. Mary Johnson and her child, Mrs. Susan Johnson and her child, Miss Townsend, and Matilda Caudle, a girl 8 years old. Late in the afternoon of the same day, Temple and Matilda came running to the house with the intelligence that someone was taking Button, the pony, from the yard. Running out to the fence, the inmates of the house discovered that the pony was being taken away by some Indians, and that a short distance off there were a large band of what afterwards proved to be the Kahata band of the Kiowas and Comanche. Instantly, the entire body of Indians made a charge upon the house and its unprotected inmates. Getting back to the house as quickly as possible, the ladies barred the door, but this was of no avail, as the Indians were not long in battering it down. A double-barrel shotgun and a Spencer rifle were in the house at the time, and both loaded. Mrs. Friend told one of the ladies to shoot quickly. One of them picked up the shotgun, and as she did so, Mrs. Friend took it from her, aiming at the Indians who were standing in the door. One Indian snatched the gun from her and tried to shoot her with the same gun. Mrs. Friend picked up a chair instantly, knocking the gun from the Indian's hands and seizing a flat iron that she threw at the foremost Indian with all her strength, striking him on the head and knocking him headlong. Recovering in a moment, the Indian strung his bow and began his murderous work. The first missile of death went plunging through the muscles of the left arm of Mrs. Friend. The second arrow, with a more deadly aim, penetrated her left breast, almost in the region of her heart, while the third struck her in the region of the heart under the arm, glancing around to the front. With these 3 fearful wounds, Mrs. Friend staggered back, fell upon the bed, and feigned death. The others in the house were ordered from the house, and after ransacking the premises of everything of value and packing it upon their ponies, one brutal beast came back, jerked Mrs. Friend from the bed to the floor, and with a fiendish yell scalped her, in the meantime cruelly hacking her left hand with a tomahawk. Hastily mounting their prisoners, they left. Mrs. Friend, as soon as the Indians disappeared, started for the nearest neighbor, nearly a mile distant, where she arrived in an almost hopeless condition. The news spread like wildfire, and a party was at once organized to rescue the captives. 3 miles from the scene of the first disaster, the Indians cut the throats and scalped the 2 youngest children. 8 miles from the house, they cut the throats and scalped Mary and Susan Johnson, the mothers of the murdered children. And 12 miles from home, they cut the throat, scalped, and crushed the head of Miss Townsend, taking Temple Friend and Melinda Caudle captives. A year afterwards, Melinda was recovered at Fort Harker and taken home to her friends, but nothing could be heard of the captive boy. Mrs. Friend gradually recovered after a long year of intense suffering, and in the fall of 1868, John Friend and his wife arrived in this county. Immediately after the massacre, his father, Eon Friend, who was at one time a member of the legislature from this county, opened correspondence with Governor Peace of Texas, who telegraphed to Washington all the facts in the case. The government sent a description of the boy to all the officers and Indian agents in the West, with instructions to secure the captives if possible, but no tidings could be obtained. Mr. Friend continued the search, not willing to give up the hope of recovering his lost boy. His father traveled over 12,000 miles, including 2 trips to Washington, and spent not only every dollar of his own money, but every dollar that John could raise in this fruitless search. And finally, after mortgaging all the property that they had in the world to its utmost limit and exhausting every available resource at their command, the son was brought into Fort Sill in December of 1872 and returned to his father and mother at El Dorado. With the habits of an Indian boy, broken in health, not recognizing even his father or mother, speaking nothing but the gibberish of the Indian tongue, a blighted and withered bud, destined to droop and die the victim of exposure, ill treatment, and starvation at the hands of the merciless savages who held him in captivity, within 2 short years, this poor but unfortunate waif was laid away in the silent graveyard, surrounded by the bleeding hearts of stricken friends who gathered to pay the last tribute to the remains of the proud boy whose life was so infamously destroyed. And thus is the father left without property, without the love and support of his manly boy, broken in spirit, while the mother not only suffers agony from the loss of her son, she has never recovered her health, being still a sufferer from the wounds she received 12 years ago. This is a true story, verified by history, and we reproduce it for the reason that many of our people are unaware of the facts in connection with the early lives of these quiet, unassuming citizens who have been called upon to undergo such terrible sufferings.